Okay, and welcome back for the third class. Um, yeah, we will be taking questions. As with last week, I think we'll uh, stop, after 25 minutes, hopefully at a logical breaking point, and ask for questions. And then I'd also like to have you thinking about whether you'd like a bibliography as a email handout at for the last session. I've usually done this with the other courses I've taught for Spark, and it's by no means a comprehensive bibliography, but it's stuff that I have uh, found particularly useful, and I'd be happy to put one together and email it off. I have Laurie email it off to you for the last class. So think about that, and then Laurie will take a vote as we go along. Okay, so let's pick up with where we left off last week, which was the Pueblo people of the American Southwest. And I think I'd emphasized that they were the only real townies living in multi-story apartment buildings, adobe apartments, while people elsewhere in what became the United States and Canada lived in villages. The Pueblo people were the only culture in north of the Rio Grande cultures that you could call a semi-urban towny society, and practiced intensive agriculture on a small scale compared with what was done further south in Mexico and in the Andes, but nevertheless intensive agriculture. I emphasized that they wore woven cotton cloth and were mostly stay-at-homes, as agriculturalists tend to be, although, as also is usually the case with human beings, there was considerable warfare, in this case, Pueblo to Pueblo warfare. And as agricultural societies tend to be, where they're living in an area where there is a problem with water, they were very conservative. No Hopi was content until he had 4 years' supply of dried corn, beans, fruit, and squash stored up. Okay, let's spend a few minutes on the Navajo and the Apache, who came down from the northwest of Canada. And I believe we also showed this map last time, the Athabascan group of people. And oops, be careful how I click those. With the ancestors of the Apache and the Navajo coming down, making a very distinctive, very separate language group here in the American Southwest. They came into the area centuries after the Pueblo people, around 1475 to 1520, that is just before the Spanish turned up. And the ancestors of the Navajo and the Apache were about the last of the Indian immigrants into what's now the United States from the northern parts of North America. How did they get along with the Pueblo people? Well, one of the histories says they tended to restrict the movement of non-Athabascans, which is a nice euphemism for bloody raiding. The Navajo, well, according to the Navajo legends. They emerged into this world from below, from the underworld, in northwestern New Mexico. The Spanish called them Apaches with knives. And what image comes to mind when you think of Apache? Raiders, warriors. What image comes to mind when you think of the Navajo? Shepherds, people weaving marvelous blankets, other works of art, pottery. And there's been quite an image transformation of the Navajo in the last few centuries, because initially, upon their arrival, they were as effective warriors as the Apache. They both came down from the north. They were both Nadene, Athabascan speakers. And they both initially tended to have a well-earned reputation for violence. The ancestral Navajo used the bow and arrow effectively. The bow and arrow, a weapon that the Pueblo people are not accustomed to. They knew about it, but it didn't fit into their culture. If you have a culture where you will strangle a deer to kill it rather than using a spear or a bow and arrow, when you want that intimate contact with the animal that you kill, the bow and arrow is not a distance weapon that you want much to do with. The Navajo and the Apache were a bit different. So we have a classic picture for a while before the arrival of the Spanish of townies defending themselves against both a hostile environment and hostile neighbors, the ancestral Navajo and the Apache. So the Pueblo in the last century or so, dealing with the Navajo and the Apache, who complicated their lives considerably. Sometimes they traded peacefully. Occasionally they raided back and forth. They didn't much care for each other as townies, as people using agriculture as their means of support, tend not to get along with the more mobile people outside their towns. But then everything changed with the Spanish conquest, and permanently changed. Okay, let's go back to right after Columbus for a few moments, to 1494 and the Treaty of Tordesillas. After Columbus discovered the Western Hemisphere, so far as the Europeans were concerned, and the Portuguese, a few years later, began bumping into the bulge of Brazil. First the Pope, and then a 1494 treaty. Okay, the background noise is over. Okay, good. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divided the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese. And this line, originally okayed by the Pope, gave nearly all of the Western Hemisphere, including Western Greenland, to the Spanish, and the eastern bulge of Brazil, the eastern bulge of Brazil and eastern Greenland to the Portuguese. Of course, later the Portuguese strayed west of that line. And as we'll see, and as we know well, the other Europeans, particularly the Protestants, didn't much care for this division of the world, and began moving into North America and the West Indies and parts of South America as their interests and abilities dictated. Okay, First, it's worth looking at the Spanish domain in North America. Keeping in mind, of course, that the Spanish under the Treaty of Tordesillas had what they felt was a legal claim to all North America. For practical purposes, the Spanish domain extended really no further than this yellow area, and New California, Louisiana, New Mexico, and Texas were frontier territories, primarily there to defend the silver mines of northern Mexico, the rest of Mexico, what they called the Kingdom of Mexico, the Kingdom of New Galicia, what's now central southern Mexico, against the intrusions of the French, the British, and later the Americans. And later, way up here, the Russians. Okay, the Spanish realized they wanted to spread north from Mexico, partly because there was always the possibility of finding new silver mines, of finding new sources of wealth, and partly because they knew that the nasty French, the nasty British, had interest in North America. They were already annoying the Spanish in the Caribbean, and they'd better get a presence up there to keep them out of the areas that they really cared about in Mexico. So in 1540, Francisco Coronado and an interesting character, Estanico, led a expedition north into Pueblo country to see what they could find. Estanico, an interesting character, a enslaved Moroccan. He was a North African. He preceded Coronado. He was their scout. And looking up into the personal history and background of Estanico, as little as is known of him, fascinating topic. So Coronado and Estanico and the Spanish first popped up in 1540 in Pueblo country, coming out of nowhere so far as the Pueblo people could tell. They saw the Spanish as cachinas, as spiritual beings at first, but they were soon disabused of this notion. Coronado was specifically after the wealthy cities that were supposedly to the north of Mexico. The Spanish for a long time were always ranging into the north, hoping to find what they call the seven cities of Cibola. And you can just imagine that the people that they encountered in Texas and New Mexico would say, well, yeah, they're a long way from here, though. They're not around here. Head north, head east, get out of our neighborhood. But they kept searching. They were searching for the next Aztecs, the next Incas. Then, 1548, rich lodes of silver were discovered in northern New Mexico. And that was the end of northern Mexico, sorry, not northern New Mexico, northern Mexico, New Santander, New Leon, in this area of northern Mexico. And that was the end of Spanish interference in New Mexico the first time around. They had lots of silver to occupy their time. mining, enslaving the local Indians, forcing them to mine it, shipping the silver back to Spain. But they came back. 1581 and the years following 1581, a man named Juan de Onate managed to conquer what's now the Pueblo country. In 1598, the conquest was essentially complete. And looking at the Spanish occupation of the Pueblo, we can see the period from 1581 to 1680 as the Franciscan period, a sort of missionary utopia. Okay, what's a missionary utopia? Funnily enough, perhaps, they seem to us, the missionaries and the soldiers did not get along. It's important to keep in mind the distinction between the two types of Roman Catholic clergy. The regular clergy, the parish priests, the regular clergy, the Franciscans, the Jesuits, the orders, usually missionary orders, and the secular clergy, the parish priests, with an archbishop over them, bishops and archbishops, operating settled permanent parishes. In Mexico and the settled parts of Spanish America, they had secular clergy as well as the regular clergy. But in New Mexico, New California, you had only the regular clergy, only the Franciscans, the Jesuits, the other orders. And they're quite a different kettle of clergy, as it were. Well, initially soldiers came with the clergy, and they're always there in the background, ready to put down a rebellion if a rebellion occurred. And the first technique of the Pueblo with the soldiers was the Pueblo women made an attempt to domesticate, to tame the soldiers, offering friendship, love, sex. It didn't work. The Pueblo tried giving gifts to the Spanish, which the Spanish looked on as tribute. The Pueblo looked upon as gifts. Quite a difference between the two, gifts and tribute. The Spanish, however, did provide some things that they felt, the Spanish soldiery and the small number of settlers that came into the area. They brought livestock, those animals that the Spanish brought for the first time, cattle, sheep, horses, seeds, and the manufactured metal goods that Native Americans everywhere found useful. The Indians were forced to give labor. The Indians quickly got tired of this arrangement, and in the late 16th century, in 1598, the people of the Eskimo Pueblo killed 12 Spanish soldiers. In 1598, they killed 12 Spanish soldiers. The Spanish military took this seriously. In 1599, they assaulted and finally captured the Sky City Pueblo, killed about 800 Native people. This broke the Pueblo resistance. They could see that military resistance was futile. So from 1599 on, there was a degree of stability within the Pueblos. There was no longer any question of open independence on the part of the Pueblo people. And the Pueblo people did the best they could to fit the new Spanish occupiers into their traditional image of the world. The friars who lived with the Pueblo people, the Franciscan Friars, were seen as inside chiefs in the pattern of Pueblo self-imagery. The soldiers were seen as the military outside chiefs. And I think, regardless of what you might think of the Catholic theology and what you might think of what we might think of the removal of religious and political independence from the Pueblo people, the friars were sincere within their worldview. In terminology used at the time, they were dead to the world. They did sincerely, I think, believe in what they were doing, however nasty what they were doing may seem to us. They demeaned the men by reassigning sex roles. The men should work the fields. The women should be domestic completely. No more hunting. The men should do construction work. No more construction work. No more Pueblo repair and construction by joint male and female teams. Basically, they encouraged, not to use a stronger term, modifications of Pueblo rituals, Pueblo worldview, Pueblo lives to fit Christian ceremonies and European standards. They put on plays. They brought in theaters, religious plays, to illustrate Christian theology, the complexities of Roman Catholic Christian theology. And in this they were consistent with the Pueblo tradition. The Franciscans saw only men as priests, as is indeed the case with the Roman Catholic Church today. The Franciscans would occasionally penitentially flog themselves if they felt they had failed in something. So to some degree, they fit in with the Pueblo intense view of religion. But of course, it was not taking nature, taking the sun, taking the rain, taking the deer as spiritual creatures with spiritual significance equivalent to that of human beings. So basically, the Franciscan message to the Pueblo people was, give up your biological father. Your new fathers are the Franciscans. Were the conversions and most Pueblo people converted to Christianity, were they sincere? No, probably not. Most were masquerades. You do what you have to do to get by. Beyond the friars, who were intensely concerned with souls, with salvation, with Christianity, the Spanish settlers, who came up in a small number, wanted Indian labor. And the Spanish governor of New Mexico, including the Pueblo country, would assign tribute and/or direct labor of Indians. That is, you could either, in some cases, you'd be assigned to work in the field of the Spanish settlers. In some cases, you could bring the Spanish, including the soldiery, tribute, agricultural tribute from your own fields. So, Indian labor, Indian land, and mestizos. As had been the case in the rest of New Spain, Spanish America, relatively few women came from Spain, particularly in comparison to the number of women that came from Britain to the east coast of North America. So let's look ahead to 1680. By 1680, and this is a pivotal years, I'll explain in a few minutes, less than a little under 90% of the non-Indian population was native born. And again, it's a small population of Spaniards, only a couple of thousand Spaniards at the most in the 17th century. 1638, almost 40 years after the conquest of the Pueblo, only about 800 Spaniards in New Mexico. By 1680, the year the Pueblo revolt broke out, only about 2,300 Pueblo. Remember, New Mexico was always marginal to the Spanish. Marginal agricultural country, no minerals, chiefly there as a frontier area to make sure that no other Europeans came down into Mexico. Not surprisingly, of course, would be surprising if it were otherwise, the Pueblo population dropped, primarily again from epidemics. 1630, there were about 60,000 Pueblo people in New Mexico, about 60,000. 1636, smallpox hit. By 1670, the population was down to 40,000, so a third of the population had died. Okay, a few more words on the Franciscans before we get to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Again, the Pueblo, the Franciscans, like the Jesuits, the other major order, wanted a theocracy. They wanted to be able to rule and save the souls, from their perspective, native people. They knew they might sometimes need the Spanish soldiers, but by and large, their interests were different. Spanish soldiers interested in loot, women, all the things that soldiers are sometimes interested in. But the Franciscans, and sometimes it's hard for us to understand this, but they really did want a theocracy. The first Franciscan prelate in 1612, the first Franciscan heading the Pueblo, the Franciscans and the Pueblos in 1612, ordered that all Spanish settlers who wanted to leave could. Since he had some authority, about half the Spanish settlers in 1612 did leave. The Franciscans wanted secular distractions removed. There was always a tension between the Franciscan prelate and the secular governor. Secular governor wanted personal profit and to run the show, and constant battles between the Franciscans and the governor. Early on, the Franciscans usually won, especially as once they came, they stayed. The same Franciscans stayed indefinitely, while governors changed every 3 years. But by the 1630s, things were not going well from the Franciscan point of view. The magic wasn't working, as they couldn't counter smallpox, they couldn't counter drought, they couldn't hold back the Apache, who the Spanish soldiers couldn't control, and the Apache on horseback now, using horses that they grabbed from the Spanish. The Apache were now raiding on horseback. So the allure of the magic of the Franciscans began to fade a bit. And the tension between the civil authorities, the civil governor and the soldiery, and the Franciscans continued. One governor, one of the Spanish civil governors, sided with the Indians against the Franciscans and said it was all right for traditional Pueblo rites to be performed. So in looking at the century, really, of the Spanish involvement in the Pueblo in New Mexico, before the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, it's in effect constant little civil wars among the Spaniards. Okay, there were occasional local rebellions, brutal put-downs, brutal repression at the hands of the soldiery, making martyrs of some of the Pueblo people killed. From the 1640s on, with smallpox, with the horseborne Apache raiding, there was a lot of misery on the part of the Franciscans, because many of them saw that they had failed. And the word got around that if you wanted sweet martyrdom, the place to go was New Mexico. And many Franciscans died early. There were probably some suicides. They felt they had failed. And the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 was certainly convincing evidence that the Franciscans had failed to convert the Pueblo people to their over in Catholicism. In 1680, a man named Pope was a Tewa up here, Tewa, from up here, not a Tiwa, a Tewa. Pope was a Pueblo religious leader. In English terms, we could say a Messiah. He saw himself as a Messiah, a religious leader. And he promised that if the Pueblo killed all the Christians, returned to growing only corn, beans, and squash, did without the crops like wheat that the Spanish had brought in, if they returned to their good old ways, the good old gods would return, bringing peace, prosperity, and harmony. Pope taught a millennial faith. In the Pueblo context, this promised an end to the drought, promised an end to smallpox, and the revolt was a success. The Spanish were driven out of New Mexico. they were driven back to their El Paso center, which had been founded in 1681. In the initial revolt, there were 170 or so armed colonists up against 8,000 or more Pueblo warriors, with the Apache helping the Pueblo just for the fun of it. But after his victory, the millennium did not arrive. That's the problem with millennial faiths. And we see this in revolts of downtrodden people around the world, really. So while the revolt was a success, the millennium didn't arrive, and Pope turned out to be a very good inspirational leader, a very good war chief, but a poor peace chief. The drought that had done the final insult that triggered the revolt, the drought continued for another 9 years, and 12 years later, the Spanish fought their way back. And that was the very sad end to the Pueblo revolt. Okay, let's open it up for questions now before we move to the next topic, which is the British, the French, and the Dutch colonization movement. So let's open it up for questions. Open up your microphones, unmute yourself, and I'll respond as best I can to your questions.
Remember, if you have trouble unmuting yourself, you can reach out to me through chat and I will assist you.
I hope not everybody believed everything I said in its fullness. No, any questions and comments?
How does the history of the city of Santa Fe play into this scenario that you have been describing? Was this, I know it's a very old city of many different cultures.
Yeah, and I'm afraid I can't tell you exactly when Santa Fe was founded, but after the Spanish fought their way back into New Mexico after the Pueblo revolt, they decided they needed a more permanent center, something north of El Paso. And I believe, and I would have to check this out, that's when Santa Fe became the Spanish center for New Mexico. After the Pueblo revolt, they weren't going to take any more chances at being evicted again from the New Mexico area. And well, eventually, of course, the Santa Fe Trail and trading with first the French, then the British and the Americans. But yeah, that's a good question, Andrea. I'll have to look it up and see when the Spanish actually founded Santa Fe.
Yeah. I think fascinating because it was a whole series of different cultures inhabited Santa Fe. So that to me is kind of interesting.
Yes, yeah, because of course, as more and more Native people became accustomed, resigned to the fact that the Spanish were there to stay, some of them got more into the the Spanish economy, and Santa Fe became the great trading center. The Pueblo people very much kept to themselves, but Navajo, Apache, some of the Utes up in the northern part of northwestern part of New Mexico, the Ute and others began trading and sometimes moving to New Mexico, to Santa Fe. But that's a good question and something I should research further. Okay, anything else? Sorry, I can't answer it as completely as I'd like to be able to.
Well, maybe you should take a trip down to Santa Fe.
Yeah, well, my friend and his spouse, who used to live there until a few years ago, have fled back to New England, so we don't have anyone to visit anymore. But yeah, I've been there. It's a fascinating place. Okay, anybody else? Comments, questions? Okay, if not, there'll be another couple of breaks for questions as we come up. And in the meantime, let's pick up with the British, the French, and the Dutch. There we are. Okay. We have to back up, as we always seem to be doing, back up a century, back to 1580. And by 1580, we have the Spanish established not just in what's now the southwestern United States, but throughout Latin America and in most of the islands of the Caribbean where Columbus had landed. So as of 1580, with the exception of the coastal bulge of Brazil, where the Portuguese, in line with the Treaty of Tordesillas, were beginning to show up. The Spanish were by far the dominant European power, even if they didn't have a presence everywhere in South America. But also, by 1580, the Caribbean was a backwater to the Spanish. Wasn't a lot of gold there. Most of the native people had died out due to Spanish epidemics and being worked to death on some of the farms that the Spanish had set up. And continuously, the main Spanish interests were in what is now Mexico, the former Aztec world, and Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, and northern Chile, the former Inca world. The Caribbean islands here in the West Indies were way stations and bases en route to Spanish America from Spain. You pass through them carrying silver back from the Potosí mines in Bolivia, coming up through here, and then from the silver mines I mentioned in northern New Mexico.
Alan, are you okay? Alan,
Oh,
we're
can you
getting
hear me?
terrible static. There we go. That's better.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah, I don't know what happened. Okay, you can hear me now.
Yes, and it's all good. So go ahead now. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the Spanish were really just interested in species, silver and gold. As time went on, primarily silver. And when they found it, shipped it to Spain through the Caribbean and across the Atlantic. Again, keeping in mind that there was this distinction I've already mentioned between the Spanish regular and secular clergy. The Jesuits down here in Argentina, Paraguay, southwestern Brazil, set up a long-lasting theocracy that also served as a buffer between the Portuguese in Brazil and the Spanish in Argentina and Uruguay. Lasted for several centuries, but that's another story. But the Spanish secular authorities and the secular clergy were interested in prosperity and power. Okay, well, here we are. You have the passage of Spanish treasure fleet through the Caribbean, regular features, as was the regular laying up of specie of silver in warehouses in the ports from which the ships sailed. What you do is you would have warehouses pile up a lot of silver, and then the sailing of the fleet for defense, the Spanish would sail in small fleets. And of course, these were tempting targets for people who had reason to hate, fear, and envy the Spanish for various reasons, as did the Dutch, the English, and even the Spaniards' fellow Catholics, the French. Okay, as of 1580, there was no particular English interest in imperial domains in America or anywhere else. But there was an interest in the part of individual Englishmen and Scots and Irishmen and Frenchmen and others in acquiring wealth. And the Spanish were shipping a lot of it across the Atlantic. Some English and Dutch sailors thought that they could perhaps break up and successfully raid those treasure convoys and perhaps even the warehouses. This was thought to be realistic because by then the Spanish and Portuguese superiority in ship design and shipborne gun mounting that had been overwhelming a century earlier when Columbus sailed had been overtaken and surpassed by Dutch and English shipbuilders and naval armorers. So toward the end of the 16th century, the 1580s, 1590s, a few greedy, skillful, confident, competent, and boastfully Protestant Dutch and English sea dogs, as they were called, began roving the seas quite unofficially in search of good old-fashioned booty, loot. They did it not only unofficially, but also uncooperatively. They competed with each other and with anyone else they came across as well. This was not any sort of colonization plan. The sea dogs were unofficial, though tacitly approved more or less by their Protestant, English, and Dutch governments. But their work, along with several other factors, did lead to English and Dutch and eventually French imperial presences in the Western Hemisphere in the next century, in the 17th century, the 1600s. Okay, formal British colonization in America and in Asia a few years later began as a series of government-private enterprise deals. What the British and what the Dutch did was form companies for trading and or colonization. The most successful of these, from the British point of view, was the English East India Company, chartered in 1600 for trade with India. And this is a distinction with Spanish and Portuguese colonization. Spanish and Portuguese colonization was by royal expeditions and by official government departments. The Dutch and the French and the Dutch and the British colonization was initially by a combination of chartered companies, corporations, chartered by the Dutch government or chartered by the British government to do business, trade, set up colonies overseas. So quite a distinction in the administrative structure of colonization. Usually rather inefficient government operations by the Spanish and Portuguese, and chartered companies by the British and the Dutch. Okay, initially the English, the British, and we're in the transition period now between England and Great Britain. In 1603, the Scottish and English kingdoms were united under the same king, under the same crown, and Wales had long since been administered by English. So from now on, we'll really talk about the British, because increasingly you had not just English, but Scottish, Welsh, and Irish participants in all of this. Okay, there were a number of reasons why initially the English and later the British were not really interested in the colonial sweepstakes business. In the 16th century, the 1400s rather, the 15th century, the 1400s, there were dynastic wars raging. In the 1400s in England, the so-called Wars of the Roses. They weren't settled until 1485 with the coming of the Tudor dynasty. Then the arguing back and forth on the Protestant Reformation, which wasn't really settled until Queen Elizabeth the Great took the throne. Also, the English preoccupation with the European role, and then the Irish-Indian comparison. Let's go through these in order. Because after all, the English had several advantages. They had a seagoing tradition, islanders usually do, lots of surrounding water to practice on, as well as a traditional dislike for and rivalry with the Spanish and the French. But those dynastic wars in the 15th century, only ending in 1485 with the new dynasty, the Tudors, coming to power. And after that, Henry VIII, we've probably all heard of Henry VIII, in the middle of the 16th century, had well-known matrimonial and religious preoccupations, as well as personally being more interested in making England a European power again after the dynastic wars. Until 1603, when the Scottish and the English crowns were united under King James I, Scotland was a hostile neighbor on the same island. The Welsh were also often troublesome, and Ireland was always an unending distraction. In short, England had local colonial problems to deal with before it could consider ranging further afield. Also, in the 15th century and the early 16th century, capital and labor was in short supply. And when money did become available, trade with places like Russia, or looking ahead, India, usually seemed like the more lucrative bets. More money in India. And on top of this, reports of the parts of North America not physically occupied by the Spanish sounded unappealing. Cold, rocky, barren. Not many English mariners had been there. But then, in the late 16th century, things began to change. One big factor turning the English to colonial interests outside the British Isles was the taking of the Reformation, and after the coming to power of Elizabeth I, Elizabeth the Great, in 1558. And under Elizabeth, after 1558, England became the foremost united Protestant power in Europe. A lot of Protestants in Germany, but Germany was disunited. A lot of Protestants in the Netherlands, but the Netherlands was fairly small. So it was natural that a violent rivalry with the premier united Catholic power, Spain, would erupt. But at first, this rivalry, so far as it was manifested in the Western Hemisphere, was only that series of profitable raids on the Spanish in the West Indies and Central America. Some of the raiders moved on to the warehouses that I've mentioned on the Caribbean coast of Central America. You didn't just try to intercept convoys coming across the Atlantic. You hid in island coves in the West Indian islands. And as you got more confident, you'd sometimes raid Spanish cities in Panama or Colombia. Okay, so where we are now, the late 16th century, you've got Elizabethan sea dogs like Sir Francis Drake, Hawkins, and others chasing Spanish treasure fleets. But even with the conscientious Protestant desire to do the Spanish all the dirt that could be managed, the idea of plantations, which is what bases, colonies were called, the idea of plantations, planting a presence in the Western Hemisphere, didn't appeal to many. And along with the distractions initially of the dynastic wars, kerfuffle over the Protestant Reformation, and the preoccupation early on with the European role, one of the most important reasons was the hideous similarity that American native people seemed to have to Irishmen. By 1600, Ireland had already been an enduring annoyance to the English since the 12th century, when the Irish first refused to be appropriated as part of England. By the late 16th century, a sort of perpetual low-level guerrilla warfare was being carried on in Ireland. And the most dismal prospect that could be put before any Englishman was Irish duty. The Irish were incredibly nasty to fight with, it was reported. The Irish, and here I'm quoting, will plash down whole trees over the passes and so intricately wind them or lay them that they shall be a strong barricade, and then lurk in ambush and among the standing wood, play upon all comers as they intend to go along. On the bog, they likewise presume with a naked celerity to come as near our foot and horse as is possible, and then fly off again, knowing we cannot, or indeed dare not, follow them. In other words, classic guerrilla warfare. The Irish were described as naked rogues in bogs and woods, whom hounds can scarcely follow, much less men. Their ordinary food is a kind of grass. Neither clothes nor houses generally do they care for. With this, their savage life, they are able to wear out an army that seeketh to conquer them. And at about the same time, literate Englishmen were reading that American Indians were a people so warlike and so nimble that they care not a whit for any footman. For if their enemies charge them, they run away. And if they turn their backs, their enemies are presently upon them. They never stand still, but are always running and traversing from one place to another, by reason whereof neither crossbow nor arquebus can aim at them. And before one crossbowman can one shot get off, an Indian will discharge 3 or 4 arrows, and he seldom misseth what he shooteth at. The comparison between Indian and Irishman, between Native Americans and Irishmen, was often made specific. John Smith, we'll be talking briefly about him, of Jamestown fame, pictures the Indians as wearing, quote, large mantles of deer skins, not much differing in fashion from the Irish mantles. Another author who had been in what became Massachusetts said that, quote, the natives of New England are accustomed to build them houses much like the wild Irish. At least, and this lasted well into the period of early English colonization in New England and Virginia. Roger Williams, the New England Puritan maverick, told the governor of Massachusetts that if the Indians were not well treated, they might turn wild Irish themselves. In short, in the early years, when the English were first thinking about colonization in North America and then beginning it, America often sounded a good deal like that nastiest of places, Ireland. Indeed, it's worth mentioning, Ireland appeared as the terror of British colonial thinkers throughout the years of empire building. In the 19th century, at the height of the British Empire, the British continued to wince at the prospect of another colony like Ireland. While by that time, at the other end of the spectrum was Canada, which cost nothing, was a steady field for profitable investment, and a firm military ally to boot. But in 1600, the English didn't have Canada to recognize as an ideal colony. They just had Ireland, a shining example of what not to get into. So again, these 4 factors mitigating against early English involvement in the Western Hemisphere. But there were some changes coming. As I mentioned, the taking of the Protestant Reformation, after fighting back and forth through several monarchs, made England and quickly Scotland and Wales strong Protestant countries. The Irish stuck with their Catholicism as much as anything as an emblem of how they were different from the British. Okay, other changes other than the taking of the Reformation. By the very end of the 16th century, by the 1580s and 90s, England was, to the men of affairs of the day, an overcrowded country. I said men of affairs, but Elizabeth was still the reigning monarch. But to Elizabeth and the men of affairs of the day, England was an overcrowded country, teeming with beggars. The population of England and most other places in Europe had dropped catastrophically after the plague, the bubonic plague in the 14th century. took a couple of centuries to really recover. But from the 16th well into the 17th century, the English population was growing rather steeply. So by 1600, the English had surplus people to send abroad. There was real concern within the country of the overpopulation problem. Laws that tried in effect to ration work by setting mandatory 7-year apprenticeship terms and forcing master craftsmen to hire help by the year rather than by the day. And there were theoreticians, there were people writing about this. Richard Hakluyt was one of them. Richard Hakluyt the Younger saw plantations, colonies, as places that could provide for the welfare of the unemployed and underemployed, and could also serve as sources of natural wealth, of pitch, wax, lumber, furs, salt, and who knew, perhaps gold, silk, wine, silver. And there was an increasing urge after the taking of the Reformation to do in the Spanish Catholics with a string of righteous Protestant colonies. And as I mentioned, English sea dogs were pouncing on Spanish shipping and settlements in the West Indies by the late 16th century. John Hawkins had bought, sold, and stolen slaves from the West African coast and surreptitiously sold them to the Spanish in the West Indian Islands and on the mainland. But then in 1572, Francis Drake became involved in an episode in Panama that was indicative of the flexibility at the time of English racial attitudes. But before we get into English racial attitudes and their relative flexibilities and the first English colonies, let's pause again for any questions that people might have at this point. There'll be a few minutes for questions at the end too. So unmute yourselves and comment or ask away.
And remember that if you're having trouble unmuting yourself, you can send me a quick chat message and I will assist.
No comments? No request for elaboration, elucidation, whatever? Okay, well, let's get back to it then, and we'll finish up with some time for comments and questions at the close of the class. Okay, I was talking about Sir Francis Drake, who became involved in an episode in Panama that was indicative of the flexibility at the time of English racial attitudes, if also of the inflexibility of religious attitudes. Drake holed up in Panama, on the coast of Panama, and here on the coast of Panama, he holed up and with a group of his sailors, but also with a group of 3,000 or so escaped Black Spanish slaves called Cimarrons. You find Cimarrons, settlements of escaped slaves, Cimarrons throughout East and South America, the West Indies islands, and Central America, increasingly in this period. So in Panama, Some 3,000, that's a lot of people, some 3,000 escaped black slaves, Cimarrons, had managed to flood from the Spanish and were setting up settlements of their own on the coast and inland. The Cimarrons had fled from the Spanish, and Drake's band of seafaring freebooters evidently got on famously with them, despite Drake's earlier career as a slaver. Both parties probably looked on that as just business, as many West African coastal people were involved in the slave trade as well. But both groups, Cimarrons and English, hated the Spanish, and Drake, of course, said, no, we're not interested in slavery. The Cimarrons appear to have occupied their time when they weren't growing food, raiding Spanish settlements to free more slaves and carry off loot. Drake liked the idea of the loot and had absolutely no objection to freeing Spanish slaves. So you had a Cimarron and Drake's group alliance. The Allies succeeded in waylaying a Spanish treasure pack train crossing the Isthmus of Panama, carrying silver from South America across the Isthmus of Panama. And they carried off a decent fortune in gold and silver. Drake soon left to head back to England with his cut of the loot. But after 3 years, his right-hand man, John Oxenham was back in business with the Cimarrons, raiding, looting, freeing slaves, and carefully desecrating Catholic churches. The Englishmen seem to have been quite effective in imparting their hatred of Catholicism to the Cimarrons. And the two groups joined in church desecration with boyish enthusiasm. Some of the Cimarrons, according to the accounts that have come down to us, seem to have taken delight in proclaiming that there was no Virgin Mary to their Spanish victims. Well, ultimately, Oxenham's band of English were captured and enthusiastically executed by the Spanish, and the Cimarrons scattered. Some were recaptured, some were killed, some scattered. But the point is that the English unhesitatingly allied themselves with black escaped slaves against white Spaniards, got on well with the Africans, and evidently felt it was worthwhile to try some informal, if negative, missionary work among them. Okay, so it wasn't just people like Drake and Hawkins raiding in Spanish America and the West Indies. There were also these theoreticians back in England who were coming with ideological justifications for British colonization. Keep in mind that the observations and reports of the English sea dogs, such as Drake and Oxenham, while they might have been exaggerated somewhat, they only reinforced the already strong belief in England in the incredible cruelties of the Spanish. And after the patent of the Cimarrons, after Drake told the story of the alliance with the Cimarrons, it came to be believed by many articulate Englishmen that other victims of the Spanish would flock to the British for protection if they were given half a chance. And of course, the other Western Hemisphere victims of the Spanish were the native people, the indigenous people. The Black Legend had become very popular in England, Scotland, the Netherlands, particularly in Protestant Europe. The idea that the Spanish were evil, did evil things, and were overall awful people. So to a certain extent, what we have here is an early example of the great sanctimoniousness of the British. Don't underestimate the importance of self-righteousness, both for good and for ill. The idea of British freedom and cultural superiority, like the later notion of American liberty, has played an important part in convincing first the British and then the Americans to get entangled in all sorts of overseas exercises, supposedly for the good of the locals. And we don't have to look back centuries to see this. We all recall the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the idea that the Americans would be welcomed with open arms. Now, in the English mind, there were apparently two contradictory images of Indians, good and bad Indians. The imagery grew partly out of the equation of Indian savagery with Irish savagery, partly from the early Spanish writings that had created the Black legend. It was obvious from the writings of the Spanish themselves that the Indians needed saving from the Spaniards, but so far as English intellectuals could tell, there were both peaceable, tractable Indians who were being abused by the papist Spaniards, and horrid, cannibalistic Indians, somewhat like the Irish. The clearest contrast came from the early years of the Caribbean, with the Taino, also called Arawaks, and the Caribs. The Caribs had developed a dreadful reputation. The Caribs name was given to both the Caribbean Sea and changed a bit more, cannibals. The Taino, the Arawaks, developed a reputation for being generally peaceful horticulturalists who had been gradually taken over by the Taino. So you had this image of two different types of Caribbean Indians. The Taino, who were nasty. The Taino, who were nice, and the Caribs, who were nasty. And this was certainly not a clear-cut distinction in retrospect. A lot of confusion, some of it deliberate, from Columbus on. Nevertheless, the idea of different temperaments of native people was quite powerful in England by 1600. And of course, there are a great variety of native cultures. And it's likely that the Taino were less bloody-minded than the Carib. No way to tell now. Tragically, except on one island, they're virtually all gone. Okay, now you've got this clear-cut dichotomy seen by some early English writers, and of course people are never that simple. But the dichotomy of good and bad Indian made it easier to come to the idea of how the Indians further north in North America might be dealt with by English colonists. Even though the natives of the eastern seaboard of North America had not yet fallen into the clutches of the Spanish, it seemed that eventually they would, if the Spanish were left to their own devices, if the Indians of North America didn't have English protection. So surely the good Indians that were probably somewhere on the North American coast would welcome English protection from the Spanish and from the bad Indians, who were likely also in the neighborhood. And it was certainly true, and the English knew this, that a number of important native neighbors of the Aztec had fallen in as Spanish allies against the Aztecs because they thought the Spanish were less of a threat to them than the Aztecs. So the idea that one group of native people would side with you against their traditional enemies was not completely far-fetched. In the 19th century, we can see this in a number of situations in North America, in the United States and Canada, that we'll get to after a while. So, some of the English would-be colonizers believed that the peaceable Indians of North America would welcome them as protectors against the Spanish and or against hostile Indians, somewhat as the Cimarrons had welcomed Drake as an ally and as a friend. And as Spanish Catholicism was synonymous with evil, the peaceable Indians were also potential Protestant converts. Now, this idea of a protective and benign advanced nation benefiting grateful folk of a lesser culture was buttressed by the idea set down by the renowned novel Utopia. Utopia, Sir Thomas More's Utopia, published in 1516 and widely read thereafter. The idea there that the land that was being wasted by lethargic and primitive people could and should be appropriated by more advanced and hardworking cultures. In Utopia, the hardworking progressive utopians would from time to time absorb less diligent people, teach them intensive agriculture and systematic labor, and drive out those who did not care to join with them. The idea of absorbing willing natives and pushing out unwilling ones has a very respectable intellectual pedigree. It was assumed that any decent band of uncivilized people, like North American Indian people, would be eager and anxious to partake of the benefits of civilized society. Okay, we're getting close to 11:30 now, so let's open it up for some final questions. Any comments, questions? Next week, we'll get into the economic grounds for colonization.
Oh, and I was interested in your discussion about the English people associating the Native Americans with the Irish. I'd never heard that before. And that led me to thinking the Irish people we think of as being Celtic, but the Celtic people really originated, I think, in Europe and maybe even in Western Asia before they got to Ireland, even though we tend to associate them with Ireland these days, which led me to think that I wonder if there's any evidence that there's any sort of a connection between the Native Americans who came over the Bering Land Bridge and therefore being from Asia and the Celts who came from Western Asia and Eastern Europe. Like, is there any DNA evidence or anything that would indicate that those two people have anything in common, ancestrally speaking?
Not that I'm aware of, and I seriously doubt that there would be, just given the geographic spread. I think, the Celts in Ireland, you had a population of relatively isolated Celts. The Celts that remained on the coast of France were absorbed by the French. Celts ended up in Scotland, and they've maintained a distinctive culture and distinctive political and cultural identity. But no, I mean, unless you go so far back that the genetic and the cultural connection, I think, would be meaningless. I think you'd have to go back several hundred generations. So I think in the case of Ireland, you're looking at a tribal people. One of the disadvantages that the Irish had against the English and later the British was that they never succeeded in very long in uniting. Now, of course, they were very good at guerrilla warfare, as the Native Americans were. But no, I don't see any significant genetic contact between the Celts and the ancestors of the Native Americans. Again, unless you go so far back that it becomes meaningless. Good question, Don, but I don't think there was such a case.
Thank you.
Okay. Somebody else must have a good question, comment.
A minute, I have to unmute my cell phone.
Oh, hello, Judy.
What about I thought that was interesting about the Cimarrons. Have they, did they eventually intermarry with the native people in Panama and so forth? And is that sort of, that would reflect the composition of what the culture of Panama now?
Yeah, some of them were in subsequent campaigns recaptured by the Spanish. Some of them did intermarry with those of the local native people that had survived the Spanish diseases that the Spanish brought with them. And remember, in places like Panama and most of Central America, you're talking about a fairly thin population until you get further up into what's now Belize, Guatemala, old Maya country. So there was a good deal of intermarriage, including largely between Spanish and former slave women, but also some Native American men and women intermarrying. There were Cimarrons, as I think I mentioned, widely distributed in the interior of Jamaica many generations later, after it was a British colony. A number of Cimarrons, a number of slaves succeeded in escaping from British sugar plantations in Jamaica, went inland, set up Cimarron communities. Some of them are still there under different names. So I can't completely satisfactorily answer that question, but a lot of them were sadly recaptured. Some of them were sadly recaptured. And as far as I know, the others blended in with later Spanish, Middle American culture. But a good question, what became of the Cimarrons? And that varied. Had a lot of them in Brazil, the Guianas and so on.
Okay, I can't unmute my cell phone. Hello?
Good.
Hello?
Hello?
Hello, this is Judy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Sure.
can.
Holy cow, this is good. My computer is driving me crazy, so I'm on a cell phone. Amazing, Ellen. I love how you can bring all of this together, including all these countries and all these things going on at the same time. And all the time we're listening to this, I'm thinking we're of course, kind of coming out of today's news and today's videos and pictures, and how this is constantly this push between good and evil and friends and enemies and good cops and bad cops, and the self-righteous doing what they think is right, hurting others. And it's a little depressing, just that comment.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning in that very first slide, it's more complicated than you thought.
Mm.
And, I tend to look for long-term causes and effects, and also similarities in people's experiences. But there's no getting away from the overwhelming complexity of the invasion of the Western Hemisphere. But yeah, thank you. I'm glad you appreciate that.
Okay. Anybody else?
Anything else? Okay. Yeah, Laurie, how can people let you know if they'd like bibliography? Email handout at the end. Can't hear
Gotta
you.
mute myself. You can email me at ldwilliams@umkc.edu, or you can quickly in the chat box say, I want one, or there is a reaction button where you can do a thumbs up. So any of those will get you on my list, or you can holler it out right now. Right now I've got Chris Taft, who has indicated she is interested. So there we go.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see you next week then. Normally, if I had a flesh and blood class, I normally have a few handouts for reading, students to read a couple of 3 articles during the course of the class. So hopefully if you're interested in this, some of the items in the bibliography will be useful as follow-up reading. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
Thank you.